the Arcane, the Last of Us, and Super Mario Brothers. All three of those had instances where the game companies were actively involved in the development, whereas all of the failures in the past where game had no involvement in the development of it.
In the past, what would typically happen is that a game company would license the IP out to a studio. Obviously, for the game company to get like a few $1 million out of it, which is great for their business. And then the studio, interestingly, would develop it, but these budgets are pretty large. And if you already spent a bunch of money on licensing, that means your budget for production and the development of it's not going to be as large. So it's actually really hard for the studios too. So I can empathize with both the game company and the studio.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Patronage, a new limited edition show from the team behind Patron, an early-stage venture fund investing in a broader gaming thesis. Join me, Amber Atherton, and my partners Brian Cho and Jason Yeh as we host roundtable discussions with leading CEOs, founders, and industry experts, debating the challenges and ideas that will shape the future of the internet. This show is not investment advice and is for entertainment purposes only. Enjoy.
My name is Jason, and I'm co-founder and general partner at Patron, an early-stage venture firm. At Patron, we believe games will shape the next internet and that our everyday reality will feel increasingly like a game. In today's episode, we're excited to dive into the topic of shaping and influencing culture and the role that games and gaming IP are playing today on that front. In the last year, it's no coincidence that some of the biggest blockbuster entertainment properties and content are being derived from games, with Arcane breaking viewer records on Netflix, The Last of Us being HBO's most watched new series, and most recently with Super Mario Brothers movie breaking box office records as the highest grossing movie of the year. Today, we're excited to be joined by two creative leaders building at the intersection of games and entertainment. First, my good friend and former Riot colleague Thomas Vu, who served as the executive producer on Arcane and led Riot's efforts in adapting League IP outside of games. We're also joined by Roy Lee, founder and CEO of Vertigo Entertainment, producer of big Hollywood hits including The Departed, How to Train Your Dragon franchise, the company behind the Lego Movie franchise, and producer of the upcoming Minecraft live-action movie. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us for this conversation today. I'd first like to start by having you each share a little bit about how you got into film entertainment and how games have shaped where you are today.
Great to be here, Jason. And it was, Jason and I, we were at Riot for at least 7 years together, I think. He was one of my closest friends when I was there for sure. And, for me, I've been an avid gamer since I can remember. I played games from the Atari 2600 all the way until today. And I don't think I'll ever stop playing games, which I think is actually going to be the experience for most young people, growing up today. I have two daughters, who are huge avid gamers. My career spanned like over 20 years in making games. I built games like The Sims, SimCity, Spore, like sort of big box products early on in my career, and then I spent the last 10 years at Riot Games. And Riot at the beginning was a company that had this incredible hit game called League of Legends. And I think a lot of us who worked at Riot were part of that, those early years, watching this company grow, but never believing that this IP could be anything more than the game experience. But I think early on, even back in 2012, 2013, there was like this sort of groundswell of support internally in terms of thinking about like how big this IP can go, and it's an unusual IP because you don't normally think a sort of esports / MOBA competitive experience could be adapted. It's like there was this concept of the video game curse that's been around forever, right? We all grew up watching like the early Mario movies and Resident Evil movies, and though they were fun, they weren't. I don't think anybody would look back at them and say that they were critically acclaimed or even commercially successful. And so it was always sort of a twinkle in the eye. And so I think when we think back about when it all started, it was really about trying to figure out how do these characters become sort of real characters by themselves, and the idea was like, how do we end up building a franchise, a Marvel Cinematic Universe type experience with these characters? And so there were, hundreds, if not thousands of people involved in the process. And over time, I think through the capabilities of building out CGs, music videos, stories, all the every single sort of facet that I think Arcane came about, and that whole experience was a fascinating experience that we will dig into. But that's a lot of what I did at Riot. I worked with not only on League of Legends, the game itself, but all the way throughout building creative development, building the music department, building all of these different I was called disciplines before tackling something like Arcane, and that was a crazy experience. It took us 7 years to do, but we're just obviously humbled and so excited that it landed very well with the audiences. So
cool. Thanks for sharing. And yeah, Roy, can you touch a little bit upon kind of your background and kind of what led you to found Vertigo and what you're working on today?
Sure. I'm Roy Lee. I'm a film producer, film and TV producer. I've had over 25 years experience in the development side of things on the Hollywood side. I was a former corporate attorney from DC, moved into film in 1996, working at a film company called Alphaville, and just learned the process of how they put together movies. And when I was there, I was like, this is the easiest job in the world. You just think of ideas, you have the studio pay for it, you develop it, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And worked there for about 4 years until I was striking out on my own. And I started out by doing Asian remakes. And I did Asian remakes because, like, as a young producer coming out, I wasn't able to access the same material more established producers had gotten, like either the spec scripts that were scripts written by screenwriters or books or any type of adaptation of material where they would give it to more established producers rather than someone new. So I was picking an area which were Asian films because at this time, the internet wasn't what it was. There wasn't streaming movies. The only way you could see foreign films was through film festivals, or maybe the occasional release theatrically or through video cassettes, VHS cassettes, which had to be subtitled. And this was like this. So that's why the exposure for the Asian films in the U.S. or worldwide was much lower than it is today. And so I just started developing some of the films like The Ring, The Grudge, The Departed, The Lake House, about 25 different Asian titles that were really well-told stories that just trying to figure out how we could adapt them to the U.S. market. So of the first 25 development projects, 18 of them were made into films. And from there, I got to develop relationships with writers, directors, more studios, and just looking for material. And I was able to develop other properties, not just Asian films. So starting out with like Stephen King novels, which was like the It novel, which we did as 2 movies, or the Lego movie, which was just based on the toys. And so in the past couple of years, I've been focusing a lot on video game titles just to use my knowledge of development to help put these movies together in a way that doesn't cause problems with the actual lore of the game, but still can attract a whole new audience.
That makes a lot of sense. And thanks for a lot of the early films that you worked on. So like I actually was a big fan of initially on the original Asian films for The Ring, Ju-on, Infernal Affairs, and then seeing them adapted into the US market was really cool to see. Yeah, I guess let's dive into it. Like Thomas mentioned in the intro, like this idea of a curse where a lot of the early efforts to adapt video game IP into films and TV shows, like they weren't necessarily things that could stand on their own. They felt more like things that like video game companies were using to try to find more ways to reskin the cat around their IP. And so I'm just curious, like, what you guys think about why now? Like, why do you think video games IP are taking off recently? Is it tied to specific IP and projects, or like what other kind of things are you guys seeing in market that's making now kind of the right time for this to happen?
Well, in my opinion, I think it's actually the arrogance of the film studios in the past, where they would just sort of look down upon the video game industry as something out there, as just another form of IP, and just like go to them and saying, you should be so lucky to let us try to adapt your material. And they to get a deal to make an adaptation of movies like the Mario Brothers or just like any of the other games. I'm not going to mention specific titles. And they just like make the movie and just not have the input of the game companies. And I think more recently, because of the rise of how games are so much more popular than film and TV combined, the power within the organization, say like even Sony Pictures doesn't make nearly as much money as PlayStation does for the corporation. And so there's more respect given to the game creators and companies. along with the fact that a lot of the people on the studio side are coming up from the world of games, so they respect the games. Whereas before, in the past, the film studios and the executives there didn't really have an idea of what the games meant to people, or like anything really other than it just being something that they could just slot into one of their creators they could help put together a movie. So it's just more respect nowadays.
I'll add to what my perspective on is. I think it takes a while for mediums to get adapted. I agree with everything Roy said, first of all, but I also think it takes a while for things to get adapted well. I think if you look at the history of Hollywood, right, like there was this time where people thought like it would be almost impossible to adapt a book. A book is like maybe 10 hours, like a novel. How do you adapt it into a 2-hour movie, right? Same with comic books, right? How do you adapt like all these comic books into a 2-hour film, right? And it took like different folks after many decades to like crack that nut. Like there were, I think, really horrendous comic book movies before comic book movies were a thing. And so I think video games just went through the same kind of process too, where it took a while for, especially what Roy said around like people who really cared and loved the games and the IPs to sort of grow up and to become their own. Video games really, I think video games only hit mainstream in the last few years. Like I think like 2015, sort of the League of Legends, the Fortnites, the Call of Duties sort of become sort of household names. And so it's still a very young medium if you think about like the history of games. And so all these folks who grew up playing games are now in the industry, right? They now have enough sort of credibility. They have enough experience that now that they can write a good script in a film. I think on top of that, video games of the past were in many ways sort of adaptations of films, right? And if you think about it, it's like a facsimile of film. Like if you played Call of Duty or Medal of Honor, you're sort of playing Private Ryan, right? You're trying to live that experience. So it's really hard to adapt an adaptation of an adaptation, right? So it's kind of silly. But now you have games that are sort of IPs wholly onto themselves. And I think that's really helpful. And then the last thing I'll say is that, gameplay is extremely visceral and interactive in a way that I think films are not. And so trying to capture that is really hard, right? So we had when we were at Riot, we met up with like Zack Snyder. He had a great line. He said, it's way more fun to shoot paintball than to watch someone shoot paintball, right? So if you're trying to adapt like an MMO or some really immersive experience, like it's really hard to capture that experience, because like if I'm fighting a giant raid boss, like how do I capture that on film and make it just as good, right? And if I'm playing a game like League of Legends, or if I'm playing a game like Call of Duty, where I spent 1,000 hours with Master Chief, right? Like in Halo, can I in 2 hours or 10 hours, if it's a series, capture 1,000 hours of love? It's really hard to do that, right? And so you have to sort of adapt it and intersect it in a way that I think is a little bit out of the box and more authentic. So
yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point around this idea that like actually doing the thing should be more fun than watching someone else do it. We had that same challenge at Riot around building esports. Like, why would you watch somebody else play the game? And then lo and behold, it became the favorite sport for hundreds of millions of people around the world. But to your point, like League, you wouldn't think of as necessarily the first IP that could break into Hollywood, given it's a team-based PvP game. It's more focused on competitive than it on the surface seems like it's based on the stories of the characters. What was it like in the early days pitching the IP, exploring, talking about League IP with like people from Hollywood, with showrunners and directors and studio heads? Can you just talk about kind of like what was that like in the beginning, and how has that kind of changed over the years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think we were not fully confident in the IP itself, so there was always like this almost like, can it happen or can it not? So number one, it was like actually like we have to first believe that this IP can actually be worthy of an adaptation that is something that we would all be proud of. And a lot of our sort of the hearts that we had, where our hearts went was like, hey, like if we can make our players, our audience proud of it, that's really the goal at the end of the day. And so we've actually met with almost all the major studios, all the top producers. Actually, Roy was a really huge advocate for us and advisor. Like he was really thoughtful about how we should think about approaching this process. And there were a ton of interest, obviously, since the league had 100 million active players, but nobody really had a good idea of how we would adapt such a thing, because League is not if you don't know League, by the way, on the podcast, League is not a story game, right? It's a 5-on-5 sort of sport where you're trying to destroy each other's base, and you play this over and over and over again, like in like sort of 35-minute time intervals. And so each of these characters, like, although somebody would play a character for like many, many hours, like they're kind of like an inch deep, right? There's a lot of champions, but each of them had like a bio pretty much, and maybe like a cinematic on their launch. And so it's like, how do we develop this? How do we convince like a studio to do this? And I think our sort of strategy was like, hey, let's talk to the studios, folks who have done this for a long, long time, but also develop what's our version of it internally. And that's where Arcane sort of spawned from, like our version internally. And again, Riot, like there's not a right or wrong reason, a right or wrong a version of doing this, right? Obviously, we saw Last of Us do very, very well, and that I think that went through a much more traditional structure. But it was really interesting because everybody had their own take on how we should do it. A lot of folks were like, hey, you should do this live action. A lot of people are like, animation is like very niche. You shouldn't do animation. Like maybe this, you should do it as a movie versus a TV show. Is it 4-quadrant? Who's the audience? Like there were a lot of different questions that we had to sort of address. And in a very strange way with Arcane, like it was almost always the most unlikely scenario. Riot is a company that really prides itself on like being like what they describe as black licorice, right? Like you either love it, you hate it, and Arcane it's all of that. Arcane was a 6-hour television series that was really for mature audiences, based on a game IP with a new animation style. Like it's literally everything that you wouldn't think is the obvious choice ended up being the choice, but it ended up working out in a bunch of different ways. And so, it's, I mean, Roy, you were there early on with us, like talking about this and seeing some of the work. Like, what was your impression?
Well, I mean, I was able to see the process of how you did put these things together, and just like some of the scripts and the ideas of how you're percolating them internally. And it was a very thoughtful way of doing that. Would normally not happen on the studio level because they wouldn't like to have do that much experimenting, and they just want like a clear path to what they're doing. And what you guys were doing was just experimenting all around, which was turned out for the best. And one of the things I'd like to add about like the 3 examples of the successes now that you're talking about, which was like the Arcane, the Last of Us, and Super Mario Brothers, all 3 of those had instances where the game companies were actively involved in the development, whereas all of the failures in the past were game adaptations where they had no involvement in the development of it.
Yeah, in the past, like what typically happened is that a game company would license the IP out to a studio, and then sort of like it, obviously for the game company to get like a few $1 million out of it, which is great for like their business, but their business is games, right? And then the studio, interestingly, would develop it. But if you imagine like these budgets are pretty large, and if you already spent a bunch of money on licensing, that means your budget for production and the development of it's not going to be as large. And so it's actually sort of really hard for the studios too. So I can empathize very I can empathize with both the game company and the studio, and we've heard so many different stories. And one of the beautiful things about working on Arcane was we had so many friends from all the other studios that were also thinking about this process. Whether it's like our friends from Blizzard who did the WoW movie, and they're like, hey, watch out for these things, like watch out for these traps, like. And so we had just a crew of really thoughtful advisors and thought leaders that really helped us think about how we want to approach like the making of Arcane. And so I'm really thankful for all those humans, including Roy.
That's great to hear. And it's always like you see the finished product. I think a lot of times it's very hard to understand like what is the actual pre-production and production process that takes place over a long, in some cases, a decade before you actually see the actual finished product on screen. And so I actually am curious, and maybe this is something you can touch on, Roy, like what has your experience been kind of adapting? So like, I think How to Train Your Dragon came from a book series, and then Lego obviously built around kind of a toy IP. And then more recently, like having more opportunities to work with game companies. Like, are there nuances that you see around the source of the IP and the type of community that kind of exists around it? Or yeah, like how do you think about adapting from different kind of mediums?
Well, I come at any of these adaptations like from two sides of it, being from the commerce side of like how popular the game is, which makes it easier to get more funding in terms of development funds from the studio side, as well as the other half, which is actually arguably more important, is the creative side of like being able to find the right person to adapt the material, be the writer or the director, like being the two most important things of adaptations. And if you could get the balance of those two, then you'll the higher level talent that you could get for a largely popular game, a very popular game, is like the sweet spot of what I look for. But like it could also come from like a high-end filmmaker who likes an obscure piece of IP. Just like the example of like James Gunn coming in and taking the obscure, at the time, Guardians of the Galaxy. And like that was because of the balance of the two things of like it being in the Marvel universe and having James Gunn, now that we know how creative and how excellent he is at making these movies and TV shows. So I don't know if that actually answered your question, but
I think that touches on kind of another idea around like mainstream IP versus niche IP. And so the two examples, Mario Brothers and League, there's probably hundreds of millions of people around the world who are familiar with these characters to some degree. Whether how deep that relationship is like remains to be seen. But then you have something like The Last of Us, which I looked up some stats. So the game sold 6 million copies its first year. I think it sold just under 20 million by the time the second game, the sequel, had come out. And yet, during its run on HBO, I think something like over 30 million people ended up streaming at least one episode of the show. It might have been closer to 40 million. And so it started off with, again, 6 million, 20 million is not necessarily that niche, but it's not hundreds of millions. And ultimately, they were able to kind of resonate with a much broader audience than just the people who played the game. And so, yeah, I guess like, can you guys just talk about like how you think about this idea of like, how niche is too niche, and what are some of the trade-offs when you think about like approaching some of these more niche properties that have like maybe a very passionate but just like a smaller fan community?
Yeah, I've only worked on the League stuff, so it wasn't niche at all. But in a way, it was because I think if you went out on the street and you're like League of Legends, like I don't think most, like if you're like over the age of 30, 35, like I think you might not know League of Legends, and I think it's one of those things where I think we're going to start to see more and more niche things become popular in sort of the adaptation, just like in the same way with comic books, right? The early comic books were all like X-Men and sort of the tier 1 superheroes like Batman and Spider-Man. And then now, like, Marvel did we talked about James Gunn and Guardians, like that's a pretty niche, like I knew about the Guardians because I played like Marvel versus Capcom, it wasn't like I was reading the comics or something. And so I think you're going to start to see that trend, but I think it's a double-edged sword, like you can have a ginormous IP. It doesn't mean it's going to be a hit. And we've seen that, like we've seen really huge IPs like fall flat, and sort of expectations are even higher, right? And so I think it's all about like the authenticity and the entry point into the IP that actually really, really matters. Like there's a version where the Super Mario movie is sort of like more grounded, right? But they went straight video game, right? Like he's jumping through a portal, right? Mario's jumping through a portal and he's in the Mushroom Kingdom, and it worked out really well, right? I think if you did that it's like almost like a Jumanji experience, right? Wow, I think, by the way, that was like a big pitch from a lot of the studios. Like League of Legends would be like you're jumping into a League of Legends world by characters outside. And it was like, I don't think that would work, right? Like Arcane needed a different sort of treatment. And so I think the question about niche or not niche is to me like sort of less important, and it's more like how resonant can you be with the audience that you're going for. And for us, like with Arcane, like you'd be surprised, like our primary audience wasn't League of Legends. Our primary audience that we went for were gamers. Like we wanted to be a love letter to gamers. And our secondary audience, and this is another one that is probably surprising, is we wanted animation, people who love animation, because the style was so new and differentiated. So our primary audience wasn't like a 4-quadrant audience. It wasn't for League of Legends players. It wasn't for like the sort of what I would describe as like superhero, like action audience, or people who love TV, dramas. It was literally like gamers, and then number 2, animation lovers. And if you think about those audiences, it might not be that large, but like you kind of resonate deeply with an audience and then have it spill out, because if you do it well, they're going to be your biggest evangelists. They're going to go out and they're going to like shout from the rooftops, like, go watch this thing, it's the best thing ever, And so I think Last of Us is actually similarly in that sense. They were in many ways uncompromising about the authenticity of that experience and that story.
I come at it a little bit more of a broader take of things in terms of the development, where for any of the IP, be it video games, be it a Stephen King novel, be it like the Lego toy brand, it's more of like, I like to look at it from either the one side of like a filmmaker or the creative talent who are absolutely immersed in that world, who love it and know it backward and forward. And I would want another person, and usually it's myself, being the general audience of moviegoers who have no idea, as if they have no preconceived notion of what it is, so that the whatever is developed can appeal to both sides. So like somebody who doesn't know it can still have as much enjoyment out of it, and as much as somebody who loves it, that'll have the Easter eggs, that it doesn't really matter for the person who doesn't know it, but it just helps out in both ways. That if it appeals to both, then that's the sweet spot for me in terms of a development project.
And Roy, I think you're totally right on that front in terms of it needs to be, because television and film are such broad mediums. It needs to be that way, where if you're too inside baseball, like you're barking up a really the wrong tree, right? Like you need to be able to appeal to everyone who comes at it fresh. And so thankfully Arcane, like you don't have to, like we get a ton of like people telling us that, yeah, I didn't know anything about League. What is this weird like experience? Like, but I loved Arcane. And so, and by the way, I'm not saying that 4 quadrants is a bad thing or not. I think if you look at Mario, you look at Sonic, you look at Pokemon, which were all very successful. I think they're all like both critically and commercially successful. They were very much for a broad audience, like, and it's really for everybody. So
I think Roy mentioned earlier, like having a good balance between like the kind of experienced filmmaking storytelling with this medium with like really strong authenticity around like the core design of the game. So I think like Last of Us probably was the best of both worlds, with Craig Mazin coming off of Chernobyl and then Neil Druckmann actually being directly involved in the action, basically effectively like co-show running the show, and having this kind of unique situation where these two people could actually like combine the best of both things to create something new that not only obviously resonates with people who spent a lot of time playing through The Last of Us, but obviously even more people who had no idea about this game kind of fell into the world and fell in love with it.
Yeah, it's really cool watching the Last of Us, like the extra scenes. Like I always like watch the sort of like little recap afterwards, and
after the episode.
Yeah, after the episode, and it's great to see like how open Neil was to Greg's suggestions. Like he changed some things and he's like, oh, that's actually makes this way better, right? Like, and I think there's a sort of ability to be not so precious about like the core IP, right? And be able to adapt it in a way that's appropriate. Like the best idea at the end of the day wins on that front, and it clearly shows in the final product. So
one thing we highlighted earlier was this idea of we're finally in a period where some of these like creative decision makers, whether it's the studio heads themselves or more importantly the showrunners and directors, they're growing up playing games and they have games that they love and that influence them a lot. And so how much are you seeing that be kind of a driver around a resurgence of interest in like some more obscure IP or some just like things that, again, on the surface might seem like super niche, but then they'll go into production because like people are super excited about it. Is that something that you guys have like begun to see?
Well, for me, it's like now because of the resurgence or just like the uprise of video game IP, all the agencies are putting it to their clients of like which piece of IP that did you love growing up, where we could help facilitate that. So it's now because of the fact that there's a perceived demand by the studios or just by the marketplace that a lot of the filmmakers are just like thinking about their childhood or things that their kids have played and wanting to just explore other areas they hadn't thought of like 5 years ago. And so because of that, sometimes I'll get a filmmaker contact me about like a video game that I've never heard of before. But unless they're like a really high-end filmmaker, it's going to be very hard to do. And then there's also like the older games, the rights are a bit more tied up than the newer games. And there's also the video game companies all have their own game plan of what they want to do in coinciding with future releases of the game. Because like a lot of times the game companies don't think of film and TV as a revenue generator as much as like more of marketing for what the game will be, or sales of games of the past. Like with PlayStation, the sales of Last of Us went up, and they were telling me that 1/3 of all new sales are from people who'd never played any of the games before and just learned about it through the television show.
Yeah, you saw that with Witcher. You saw that with Cyberpunk. You saw that with so many different games, right? And I think when you talk about IP, old IP, like Castlevania is the one that comes to mind, right? Like I know there are new Castlevania games, but I grew up playing all the old ones, right? And it was incredibly authentic to that experience, and that was one of the first sort of indications that this thing is going to be really cool. And so I do think that some of these older IPs will have interesting resurgence. Like I grew up playing everything from like Ultra Beast to I want these experiences like Metroid, right? I'd love to have a Metroid adaptation, and and more recently, Roy's sort of giving props to Roy and Vertigo over here, but like Warhammer, right? Warhammer is a game IP in my mind. It's a board game, right? Obviously, but or toy soldiers, and that's incredibly interesting to me. I can't wait to see what that adaptation looks like, and so I'm really excited to see like some of these old IPs come back because they're part of our childhood, and I think it's in the same way the sort of Marvel comics and DC comics are now are now popular or has been popular in the last 10 years.
You even mentioned firsthand, like there's obviously a lot of people who grew up reading comic books, but there's even more people who grew up playing the video game versions of these comic books, which is the actual touch point that they have with these characters and these stories. And so I think that's certainly an interesting dynamic where it's kind of those two worlds are kind of like bleed together because of the fact that there's so much overlap in terms of the underlying like user experience. One
thing that I wanted to highlight what Roy said, I think it's really important to highlight, is that though I think game companies look at because games are such highly profitable businesses, they look at the film as being like sort of ancillary or marketing, right? But I actually think it goes way beyond that. Like we looked at it as being what I describe as like a love letter to our audience, right? Which is like, what's the LTV of that audience over like the next 50 years, right? And I think when you create something that is culturally accepted and lauded, then you create like such a deep level of pride and love within your audience that they're with you forever. I mean, Disney's figured this out for a long time, right? Like I go to Disneyland and the first thing I hear is like the up song, right? The sort of background music, and I'm like, I'm in, like whatever it is, I'm in, right? Like, and so I just think I think one, like it really transcends culture, which is really, really important. And two, like I think I think these IPs, because they live on for so long, there's all these products that appear, and so and it's kind of like a backwards thing, but it makes sense to me in my mind. Like, if Disney was like, hey, we want to make a movie so people fall in love with, like, say, like Elsa from Frozen, right? Or like the film. That's a 2-hour experience that you experience once, right? And then the theme parks and the merchandising is your 365-day experience, right? Like now I can experience like Elsa as a figure on my desk. Well, game companies are taking the sort of opposite approach, which is like they have the 365 days a year experience, like with the League of Legends, right? Maybe for a game that's like a single play game, like maybe you'll get like 100 hours or something. But then now if you create the sort of like very spiky 2-hour or 10-hour experience, then people can reflect back on the sort of 365-day experience and actually have even more value to it. So it's very symbiotic in the sense. And I think it's just like, it's like inverse of like the Disney strategy, but it's at the end of the day, love, right? Like that's what you're trying to build. You're trying to build cultural and validated love that is shared by everybody who touches it.
One nuance that we're kind of living in now is that there's just, people don't just consume video content at the movie theater. There's like an unending number of streaming platforms and an unending library of content that exists. And so I'm just curious, like, what are the challenges then of like, if you have these game companies where maybe it's focused, like a company like Riot's more focused on like long-term relationship building with their audience, but other game companies, maybe it's to promote an upcoming game that's launching, versus on the studio side or from a streaming platform side, like they certainly want to drive either subscribers or track the number of people who are watching. So I'm just curious, like, are those things potentially like harder to deal with? And in the case where you finally do like find a project to greenlight, is there a strong push to like target the existing gaming community when you're launching one of these properties, like a film adaptation or TV adaptation of the game? Or is it more broad and it's just you're trying to target as many people as possible to be interested?
I think, and again, I'd love to hear Roy's perspective on this too, but I think for certain companies, I think that is the case. Like, I've talked to the folks over at Cyberpunk a few times on this front, but I wonder if Edge Runners is like very much like, hey, let's build a funnel for people to have awareness back into the game. I think for Riot, it was, in my opinion, it was different. It wasn't like a direct, like you play Arcane and you go play League, like that's a nice to have, but it really is like Arcane was like a standalone product that if people fell in love, they'll just fall in love with Riot, the brand, League of Legends, the IP, and anything that comes out of it is great. I think that was like very much the intent versus like a direct, any kind of direct funnel.
My answer to that was like for the studios, like the legacy studios, like the Warner Brothers and Universals, they are trying to make the movies or the TV series to appeal to the widest possible audience while using the existing fan base as the base, and to make sure that they also appeal to that, so that they definitely would not just want to appeal to the gamers. They want to play the widest audience. Whereas on the streaming side, it's a different equation there because they're more of like the upstarts. So like maybe like the Netflix compared to like a Disney, where Disney has their Marvels, their Star Wars. And so they would want to utilize the game IP to build a franchise universe there. And so they would start developing something that could appeal to like some core gamers, as well as for the niche part with the smaller part with like the animated series in terms of like Edge Runners, as well as do like a $200 million, they'd love to do a $200 million Cyberpunk movie, and just like to appeal to like a wider audience, but it's just like to build a whole universe within their platform themselves.
And I think Edge Runners worked out really well. Like my understanding is that it's really like significantly boosted Cyberpunk sales, and that game is like it had a unfortunately a sort of release that was not optimal, but it's sort of recovered in a big way since then.
So I guess one of the last topics I want to cover is just the idea of when you're tackling a more mainstream IP, there's certainly a lot more expectation, and there's a lot more potentially pressure to appeal to like that very wide audience. And so I think back to like League grew up alongside Twitch. And so I'd say Twitch as a platform started to kind of really take off because of the fact there's so many people streaming League, whether it's esports, whether it's just like entertainment focused streamers. on the flip side, you think about YouTube, and YouTube really blew up because in addition to League, like people were watching Minecraft, like people play Minecraft videos. And I don't have to touch on kind of anything's not public, but just curious, like for a property like Minecraft, where it seems like it's been in development it seems like a great candidate for some type of movie, whether it's more on the animated side, live action side, to be made over the last 10 plus years as the game was taking off. It's curious, like how does a property like that kind of like make its way through development? And like what are some of the challenges and nuances of dealing with something that's so broadly appealing?
Well, one of the instances that we went through on Minecraft was that we actually did have a version of the movie that thought we were going to go into production with, that we had a script written, and then we found out it had almost the identical concept of what Jumanji was, even down to like the after school students that were in detention that uncovered something that opened a portal to another world that brought these people in. It was insane how close they were. So we had to reconfigure everything and start from scratch, because even though they were both independently developed, but once we saw that they were already going, that we realized we couldn't do that. And so in another world, we could have had what you saw in the Jumanji movie actually be the Minecraft movie, with the version of people going into that world and having the same sort of experience of how to get back. But that was very specific for Minecraft. And so it's just a matter of like, you don't know what works until you just experiment with like different scripts and hear different takes from writers and get the right filmmakers together, because it's almost like a miracle any movie comes together, because there's so many pieces that have to come together at the right time with the writer, as well as the financing and having a director with a certain people level of talent they want to be in it. So it's and there's no real set method that everyone has to adhere to. It's just like each movie is a different beast.
Yeah, and to that point, it's like Minecraft is a literal sandbox where you can build any like other experience within that world. And same thing with League. I think the preconceived idea in the prior generation was like, you make a superhero, you make a video game movie, you just use all the characters and you put them all in the same movie. And I think the thing that we kind of look deeply at Riot is like, well, we would actually prefer to create like much more depth in like individual characters, certain parts of the world, so that you can slowly kind of reveal different parts of the universe, so that it really is this universe that people can consume over time. And I think like Minecraft, similar thing. Like there's not like one way to do it. Obviously, there's like so many potential different directions, which is why like a Jumanji style movie was potentially like close to being made. And there's probably like 50 other versions of like very different things that could be very appealing to people who play Minecraft.
Both of these IPs are IPs that you can tell a lot of different stories, which obviously has incredible potential for expansion, but also like, where do you start? You know, like with League, it was one of those things where it was a head scratcher for a lot of people that it started in Piltover and Zon, which is like sort of like this like very like steampunk sort of place, and steampunk's never worked in in anything. It seems like and I think it was our showrunners Christian Link and Alex G, like they were pretty like staunch and had a great take on it that actually differentiated. So when you watch it, it doesn't feel like steampunk, but it is like, at the heart, like a steampunk-esque sort of setting. But a lot of people were like, why don't you start in Demacia with Garen and Lux, And then the challenge is like, you start in a place like Demacia, you get compared to Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or all the sort of traditional knights and sorcerer fantasy out there, right? And so it was a really interesting, like, again, like it goes back to what Roy said earlier, right? Where do you enter? What's the entry point and how authentic it is, right? And if you do it and you can tell a good story, I think it sort of plays out well.
One recent example, and it's something of like that maybe interesting you, Thomas, is The Sims. Like what was when I was trying to figure out how we could adapt it. Met with actually, I just got lucky. The first filmmaker that I met with, who was absolutely in love with it, came up with a very specific take that I didn't know if it would work out very well. And when we presented it to the game company, the first thing they said after it was done, they were like, thank you for not pitching us a variant of Free Guy in the Sims world, because we've heard that at least 20 different times in the past year. And her take was like very specific to, and they're like, we love this. We use this format for multiple movies, and we're so happy that this was a different version of it. And it wouldn't have come unless there was just like trial and error of hearing different takes of from different people. I just got lucky. I heard the first one, but they've gone through 20 of them before they landed on the one they liked.
But I guess like you mentioned this earlier, like studio heads are they try to draw patterns with what's happening in the market. Do you feel like we're ready for like multiple versions of like things like The Last of Us, which started off pretty niche, kind of going broad, and then like really large adaptations like Super Mario Brothers actually doing the IP justice and reaching broad audience? Or do you feel like right now there is just like people are just throwing things at the wall and seeing what will stick?
I think right now we're in the stage of where comic books were 20 years ago, and there's going to be a surge of seeing all the success of some of these games. You'll see a lot more adaptations, some good, some bad, and the cream will rise up, and the better ones will thrive and build out universes. But it's going to get to a point where it's going to be too much, and it's just like we just have to ride the wave and create as much good content as we can.
Yeah, I tend to agree with what Roy said. I think you can look at the film industry and the books industry and all these different industries as good examples. Like even in games, right? There's only so many good games every year, so many good films every year, and I think there will be a lot of adaptations, and the good stuff will rise up and be remembered, and it's like the Pareto principle or something like that. Like it's like the best stuff is gonna sort of entertain 90% of the audience eyes or viewers' eyeballs. Yeah.
And a point that I thought of and didn't get to mention earlier about, you're talking about niche games that are, and even the older ones. In fact, like the older games aren't necessarily the ones that are easily adapted, because like the early versions of games like Pac-Man to like Ultima and like even like the early stages aren't necessarily the ones that could really be adapted that easily compared to like the games now that have more like worlds that are built in characters and storylines that, like at least when I was growing up, with the arcade games, it's rare that you could adapt Joust or Defender or things like that, which are
Yar's Revenge.
Yeah, Yar's Revenge.
Well, we're seeing something else play out now, which is like MUDs. So like text-based games. Now like the internet's turning into a MUD with ChatGPT, and people just like figuring out ways to like have conversations to actually like drive how the internet works. But I'm actually curious, and this can be the closing kind of topic and point, but what do you guys think about like how advancements in AI are kind of like influencing things that happen both on the game side and then also kind of in the film, in the movie making side?
It's going to be interesting to see how it affects the business as a whole. I think right now it's like more of the low end content will be able to be created via AI without much of a problem. Like just like, not to disparage CoComelon, it feels like because I have a 4-year-old, like when I see CoComelon, that could easily just have been created by AI and you would have not batted an eye. Whereas like the higher end animations would be impossible to, at least in this current format. So right now, I think the lower end content is going to have problems in terms of like with the creators wanting to monetize it, or like the filmmakers or the writers and directors in that area are going to be sort of pushed out. But yeah, it's hard to say what it's going to look like in 5 years, though.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think in the 5 to 10 year time scale, everything's up for grabs. Like AI is just moving so incredibly quickly, and you start with authoring, right? And so you get like image, text, animation, VFX. Like you start to get all the stuff, and then I think the magic is how they all come together in sort of emergent and surprising ways. And the question at the end of the day for me is like the best content out there, the films and the shows and the games tend to have like a very sort of like deeper expression, like a let's call it a soul, right? There's something about it that's sort of intangible, right? Now the question is the AI going to be able to capture that aspect, or is it like like Plato's cave, right? Like, is the AI only able to play within the box that is a sort of collective human experience, or can it go beyond that? And I think the best content goes way beyond that. Like, it has just a much deeper meaning.